Hi, I'm Wes Allen with DM Tales, and today we're going to talk about the world that I built. Roll the opening. Okay, so for the last 2 weeks, we've talked a little bit about the way that I build maps and what I look for when I build the maps, and then what I use to keep track of my lore, creating all the things that make that space feel like it's actually alive. Today I want to talk a little bit about the world that I built, that world of Frosden, which is where my current adventures are taking place. I've alluded to this in the past couple of videos, but today I want to flesh it out a little bit and help you see exactly how all this came together to create this living, breathing world, at least in my mind anyway. As I said, I started with the map, and to me, in the world of Frosden, the key element that creates that adventuring environment is the climate. As I talked about in my map making episode, the climate suddenly had gotten colder a couple of centuries before the current adventures are taking place. The population then had to move south. That created conflict with the people who are already living in those southern regions. And the empire that had ruled over all of this territory began to fracture. It just couldn't keep up with all the growing needs as the climate shifted and people began to separate more and more one from another. What that led to was the collapse of that imperial society and the creation of a whole new societal order. And this is the world in which the players are now adventuring. As I went through and tried to make it, after creating the literal environment, the climate in which these people are going to be walking around and playing, I thought it would be better, instead of starting with political entities, the different kingdoms that arise from the collapse of that empire, but to talk about the different organizations or the different societal factions that are trying to rise up and fill the gap that this former empire used to fill. And I came up with a few major ones, although I can't give you too much information because the players in my campaigns don't quite know all this stuff yet, so I'll be a little bit general. The first of these organizations is a society that's dedicated to the old god of the empire. This has gone to become kind of an semi-underground religion right now. There's not a whole lot of people who overtly worship this god, and there's different things that they are pursuing that identify them to each other. Really, they don't have any intention of bringing back the glory of the old empire. That's actually another faction. They're just trying to reap some of the benefits that the imperial order used to have. And it makes for an interesting dynamic. The Briars are my order of druids in this world. They care for the natural order of things, the forest and the mountains and the hills. All the woodlands where folks who are, civilized don't tend to hang out all that much unless they're out there for work. And the Briars don't have a whole lot of time for civilized people. They refer to them as settlers. They really resent in some ways the encroachment of settled lands, farmers and hunters and cities and whatnot. So they don't have a whole lot to do with the people who are, out in the new kingdoms or in that new social order. But as the adventurers go out, as things start to settle, and the kingdoms which had risen in the wake of the old empire's fall, they get settled, they start to expand out into areas that had been abandoned. So that's going to bring them into conflict with the so-called civilized people. Two of the organizations which appeared in the wake of the empire's fall are really followers of two gods that had not been known before. The first of these is the Arneon Society. This is something that's been mentioned a little bit in my adventures, although I think my players have missed it so far. And the Arneon Society is dedicated to a god of life. That's really what they're after. They want to see life flourish in all of its forms. They're not exactly a very well-regulated or tightly organized religion at this point. You have folks within that organization that are more chaotic, some are more lawful. They have conflicts with each other about the best way to promote life. This is all types of things that these folks are going through. This was originally going to be the group that my players were attached to in my original adventure before I got sidetracked into my Hallmark adventure. That's the one that's based on Hallmark tropes. But they're still hovering around in the periphery of things. And I find them rather interesting because what does it actually mean to promote life? how's that going to work out? Does promoting life mean that you take out the goblins in the hills? Does promoting life mean that you allow certain settlements to get cut off so that another society can flourish? How do these people interpret the ways of this God who really is new and unknown? One of the cool side quests that I'm going to give to folks who get attached with this organization is to discover new holy writ as they go about doing their tasks for whatever branch they're attached to. And they'll have to bring that back to their librarian to try to figure out what is this God wanting us to do, because they don't know right now. They just know they want to be on the side of life. I kind of find the ambiguity of that to be rather refreshing. And then the other group that arose in the fall of the empire, which serves a God that hadn't been known before, is a church that's dedicated to order. Not good, not evil, just order and stability. As long as that happens, they're happy. And this organization finds itself in conflict with all the other ones because in their minds, everybody else is trying to sow chaos. You can't have life without civilization, so they don't get along with the Druids. The God of the Old Order, there's a reason why the society collapsed. Why would you want to continue to serve that God? And then the Arneon Society, they're running around promoting life, and sometimes when you do that, you can disrupt order. And this is what they're really about. So where they're in charge, sometimes they're rather oppressive because they see other groups as being disruptive to their goals, and they're going to make sure they know about it. Now, I've already talked about many of the deities that exist in this world when I was speaking about organizations, because so many of them are based around that. There's only one really that I want to highlight beyond that, and that's the deity of the dwarves, Laba-esh. Now, Laba-esh was the deity of both dwarves and of the forge. So a lot of blacksmiths and armorers worship this deity even to this day. The dwarves of the mountains, however, they stopped worshiping Laba-esh long ago. Because when the empire enslaved them, they figured this deity must not be powerful enough to protect us, and we don't want anything to do with that. And so Laba-esh was rejected, and Laba-esh's shrines were torn down, and the deity's clerics were driven out of the mountains. They wanted nothing to do with this former divine being who watched over this people. And this is the case even though Laba-esh and the god of the old empire are sworn enemies. Laba-esh is very much trying to tear down the god of the old empire and allow the dwarvish people to rise, but the dwarves of the mountains just don't want to hear it. They don't want anything to do with that. Now, those clerics who got driven out and now they live out in the open lands, they continue to worship. And blacksmiths' guilds and armorers' guilds will often have a cleric of Laba-esh who is a dwarf who lives out in the open lands. As you can imagine, the dwarves who come from the mountains meet these folks. The sparks sometimes can fly. I like this type of thing. This video got a little long, so I'm going to split it into two. Next week, I'm going to deal with all the political factions that arose after the fall of the empire. Until then, happy playing.